Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. So, hi everyone. My name is Cynthia Ortiz-Naranjo, a student from Monterey, California in the United States. I thought it would be nice for you all to know a little information about me before I begin my presentation. I'm very excited to be here presenting, and I'm grateful for this amazing opportunity. At my school, I play water polo, soccer, and lacrosse, and I'm part of the chamber choir. So you are correct in assuming that I like being busy. I was a mentor for both the UNHCR Economic Inclusion of Refugees and Reducing Marine Pollution cohorts for MUN at home. I'm also a diplomat for North America for MUN Impact. At my school, I'm the head of delegate training in our MUN club. As a result, I'm experienced and passionate about helping teach others. Until I studied abroad in Germany, I unfortunately had never met a refugee before. My host mother was thankfully a German teacher that teaches refugees German and helps them transition to their new lives in Germany. As a result, I had the privilege to meet them, and that was one of the few times I ever experienced culture shock. Contrary to my assumptions, they looked like normal teenagers my age and had iPhones and modern clothing. I was truly shocked because of my preconceived assumptions of refugees. However, reality soon set in as I noticed their thin bones and short heights, which are all signs of malnutrition. When I watched Aladdin with them, they pointed at the villains and said that I reminded them of the Taliban at home. I was immediately humbled as I realized the privilege I had as an American and knew from that moment on that I wanted to help them whatever way I could. Soon after, as I walked through the streets of Berlin, I noticed that refugees were in ways segregated from Germans. Even though they have managed to escape their oppressors, refugees are still oppressed when they are in Germany. I soon learned about the Alternative for Deutschland, Germany's anti-immigration party, and I learned in US history class that year that there is a rise in nationalism in European countries. I researched the rationale behind right-wing populist parties and found that most were spreading false information about refugees, which ultimately criminalized them. From then on, I've been passionate about debunking commonly spread lies about refugees, and I even wrote about this in my economics final paper. In light of the US accepting less and less refugees, I wondered how I, a high schooler, could help make a difference. After extensive research, I soon came to the conclusion that educating people on the benefits of refugees is crucial for their survival. Every 10 minutes, a child in Yemen dies, according to the UNHCR. And each year, the US has admitted less and less refugees since the beginning of the Trump administration. As a mentor for the UNHCR Economic Inclusion of Refugees, I had the privilege of mentoring very kind and eager delegates. I didn't realize how much I would enjoy being a mentor and how kind the delegates would be to me. Ultimately, my hardest time as a mentor was helping the delegate of the United States because their resolution was too good to be from the United States. That their creative, progressive, and educational focused solutions did not align with US foreign policy. Telling the delegate to more accurately represent the US made me sad and angry at the xenophobic and nationalist government I live under, and it gave me even more motivation to help educate others on who refugees really are and why all able nations should and have a responsibility to open their borders to them. I may not have $1 billion to donate to NGOs such as UNICEF, but I hope through my presentation at the Global Summit that I can inspire both delegates and adults to become passionate about helping refugees such as I. For starters, I like to begin by stating Webster's dictionary definition of refugee. By definition, a refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. However, Webster's dictionary definition is not the basis of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR for short, but rather the 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention, which is the basis of the UNHCR's work. According to the Article 1 of the Convention, a refugee is defined as a person who is outside his or her country of nationality or habitual residence, has a well-founded fear of persecution because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and is unable or willing to avail themselves. You may ask, why does stating these two definitions even matter? Well, the answer to that is that the 1951 Refugee Convention fails to include language for persons escaping from natural disaster. It can be hard to visualize each part of the definition, especially in a modern day context. So I thought it would be helpful to break apart the definition of a refugee and focus on each part individually. Keep in mind that these three parts of the definition can overlap. So an example of a present day refugee crisis in which refugees are escaping war is the Syrian civil war. In 2011, pro-democracy protests emerged in Syria, which led to brutally security forces which opened fire on demonstrators, killing several, which led to more and more ongoing violence, which is still happening. Both sides have committed war crimes according to the UN, and have these crimes include murder, torture, rape, and forced disappearances, use of chemical weapons, and using civilian suffering as a war tactic. 5.6 million fled Syria, and over 400,000 have died because of the civil war. It's important to note that foreign involvement in the Middle East is a root cause for the civil war. Refugees escaping persecution, such as the Rohingya are often not spoken about, because when people think about genocide, the first thing that usually pops into one's mind is the Holocaust, an ethnic cleansing of majority Jews by Nazi Germany in the 1940s. Unfortunately, ethnic cleansings are still being committed to this day. For example, the Rohingya are a Muslim ethnic minority in the country of Myanmar. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres referred to them as one of, if not the most discriminated people in the world. The military targets the Rohingya communities and burdens their villages, kills them, and also rapes them. Since the 90s, the Rohingya have been forced to flee the country of Bangladesh. By 1997, 230,000 refugees were forced to return to Myanmar. According to BBC, the Human Rights Watch has called the crisis a deadly game of human ping pong. The genocide has continued persistently to this day. Bangladesh has taken in over 700,000 refugees. However, refugees in these camps experience sexual assault, exploitation, and abuse. 2/3 of these refugees consist of women, children, and the elderly. Not to mention, severe flooding into refugee camps in both India and Bangladesh has led to malnutrition, cholera outbreaks, and water shortages. As more members of the Rohingya community are in need, Bangladesh and India refuse to take more. Some Rohingya attempt to travel to neighboring countries such as Thailand, but are denied access. To add on, human traffickers have taken advantage of the situation, and the conditions on their ships are likened unto the conditions of a 1700 slave ship, with abuse and exploitation. Most of these passengers are dehydrated children, and many have died on the way. The United States has led the charge in response to the Rohingya crisis, providing nearly $542 million. Other countries, not so much, and they need to step up. When intercepted by Thai boats, they sometimes throw them instant ramen packets and water, but according to the New York Times, in refusing to give them shelter, the Southeast Asian authorities condemned many Rohingya to death. Our silence is violence. Failure to take action and accept Rohingya refugees is killing them. This needs to change now, especially since international aid to Myanmar has ended, which resulted in over 250,000 Rohingya Muslims without medical care, food, and other vital humanitarian assistance. According to the Human Rights Watch in 2018, due to the current pandemic, 80% of aid workers have been barred from the camps. Important medical campaigns like measles vaccines have been halted. An example of refugees escaping environmental disasters can be found with the people of i-Kiribati. They live on a remote Pacific island nation and are among the first people in the world to be displaced by climate change and sea level rise. Yes, you heard correctly. Climate change is a humanitarian issue. Climate change has been proven to disproportionately affect Indigenous people and minorities globally. It's important to emphasize the fact that climate change is a global issue, not just the i-Kiribati's issue. By 2050, scientists predict that climate change would displace over 200 million people. Because the 1951 Refugee Convention does not include language that refers to persons displaced in the context of disaster and climate change, the pact does not give legal protection to such victims. World leaders have thankfully signed the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration to protect migrants who flee their homes due to natural disasters or climate change. With rising and warming sea levels, stronger waves pose a threat to the island nation of Kiribati. The world's leading contributors for CO2 emissions, such as the US, Russia, and China, are to blame for the rising sea levels and extreme weather worldwide, not just in Kiribati. Ironically, the US has left the Paris Accord in 2017. As a result, the people with one of the lowest carbon footprints are those experiencing climate change the most. The government of Fiji has been open and welcoming of the Kiribati refugees. However, as more i-Kiribati apply for refugee status in New Zealand, they are rejected because they don't deem climate change as a valid reason to become a refugee as of 2017. Although in 2019, the UN finally adopted a target, 10.7.4, reduced the proportion of the population who are refugees by country of origin, the UN definition in the 1951 Refugee Convention still does not include language for persons displaced in the context of disaster and climate change. To fully understand the definition of refugees, we must also learn about their rights and entitlements. The obligations of refugees the refugee holding countries and countries of the 1951 Refugee Convention. I put some of the articles on my presentation, and I'll only read a few for time. Some of the rights are the right to housing, the right to education, the right to public relief, and the right to freedom of movement within the territory. These rights sound amazing. However, it would be even more amazing if countries didn't consistently violate them. Countries such as the US, Australia, France, Italy, and Hungary, to name a few, have been found to violate the convention because they have either barred or severely restricted the inflow of refugees, and also have penalized those who have assisted refugees, in particular the US and Italy. Yes, you heard correctly. The world's developed and wealthy nations are denying refugees their rights and violating the convention both directly and indirectly through foreign policies such as the Muslim ban, bans on asylum seekers, and prioritizing the influx of Christian refugees. Discrimination and racism of any kind should have no place in foreign policy. One example of a Good Samaritan being punished for helping refugees can be found in Italy. Captain Carola Rackete was placed under house arrest by the Italian government for carrying rescued migrants on the Mediterranean Sea. Although Italy had issued a closed-door policy on refugees and migrants, Captain Carola Rackete blatantly opposed this and was defended by UN spokesperson Stephanie Dujarric. Sea rescue is a long-standing humanitarian imperative. It's also an obligation under international law. No vessel or ship master should be at risk of fine coming to the aid of boats in distress where loss of life be imminent. That's a question. That's an issue of principle. This happened 2 years ago. In the US, Scott Warren, a volunteer for a nonprofit humanitarian organization, No More Deaths, faced felony charges because he provided food and water for a pair of migrants who were found hungry and dehydrated in the desert of Arizona and fleeing from Central America. Multiple volunteers have been arrested, and to give you a timeline, Scott Warren was arrested in 2018. This is unacceptable in the 21st century, honestly. Humanitarian work should not be criminalized. It should be encouraged, especially by countries who have signed the 1951 Refugee Convention, such as Italy and the US. Border restrictions, along with a complex application for asylum, leads to less than 1% of refugees living in camps to qualify for resettlement, and even less to actually resettle. Most refugees in camps are women and children. According to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, such border restrictions are not in line with the Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, because individual determination of refugee status and assessment of individual protection needs are not made possible. The Secretary General also pointed out that a vast majority of refugees are hosted by developing countries, including Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. So clearly, developed nations actually need to step up. Another prominent key document, in addition to the Refugee Convention in Geneva, is the Dublin Regulation, which obliges each European state in the Union to adhere to certain rules in regards to asylum. This process takes about 2 to 3 months. The country responsible for the processing and evaluation of asylum claims that the country that an asylum seeker first claimed asylum or arrived at. Another part of the Dublin regulation is that refugees have a right to family relocation in 3 cases. The Dublin Convention clearly is not working that well, since it places the burden on Greece and Italy, which is where refugees often arrive in the thousands by boats. Canada and Uganda are two noticeable countries that have accepted a lot of refugees and should be congratulated for their work, but more work needs to be done. Part of the reason why European leaders have not shown the support they should be for refugees is the pressure at home to reduce migration using nationalist, racist, or nativist rhetoric. According to the chair of the Kofi Annan Foundation, the mainstream leaders should have started early on explaining to the public why is it that these refugees are coming and what needs to be done. By not doing so, they allow the extremists and the right-wing parties to take the issue in a completely different direction, and they are playing defense and catch-up. While researching this presentation, I realized that knowing the definition of a refugee is simply not enough. Since many, including world leaders, spread false information about the people who seek asylum, it's important to understand the long process and that being a refugee is not a choice for these people. I'll use the US as an example for this, since the current president has justified enforcing an 18,000 cap on refugees for the upcoming fiscal year because there's a possibility that the US might accept terrorists in disguise, or to directly quote him, a Trojan horse, and they could be ISIS, I don't know. The process for application it was explained by news commentator Samantha Bee. She explains that the refugee program undergoes the most amount of security screenings. The process of resettlement is very long. We create a case file and we enter all the information to a database, which is shared with the FBI, National Counterterrorism Center, and the Department of Defense. Less than 2% of the caseload are actually single men. These are survivors of violence and torture, and they could also be LGBTQ refugees. I think people don't understand that refugees can't just sign up for resettlement. They can't go and say, hey, I want to go to America. A terrorist would somehow have to get past the UNHCR, the UN, the State Department, Homeland Security, CIA, and the National Counterterrorism Center. Let's pretend they didn't get caught miraculously. They still can't choose where they get resettled to. Honestly, to quote John Oliver, peanuts have killed more people in the last decades than terrorist refugees. And yet, rising nationalist parties still believe that the possibility of a terrorist infiltrating refugee camps is possible and that a more serious vetting system is needed. The risk should not be denied, of course, but at the same time, it should not be exaggerated to such a large proportion. Another argument against refugees is a cultural difference, and that they bring different expectations. Especially in regards to Muslim refugees. The Alternative for Deutschland has been promoting the slogan that Islam gehört nicht zu Deutschland. Islam doesn't belong in Germany. This argument is clearly xenophobic and discriminatory. They claim that Muslims bring different attitudes towards women, work, society, and social custom, according to the party co-chair. This leads to an overgeneralization. For example, in 2015 and 2016, there were sexual assaults in Cologne on New Year's. Around 1,200 women in Germany reported being sexually assaulted on New Year's 2016. A vast majority of the assaults occurred in Cologne. Of course, this behavior should not be tolerable by any means necessary. Unfortunately, the only reason this even gained global attention is because this time it involved majorly refugee men. By shifting the narrative against refugees in general are criminalized, and the fact that sexual harassment in big festivals has increased during recent years by native-born German men is ultimately ignored. In fact, leading feminist groups such as #WithoutException have urged the German government that the anger after the Cologne incidents should not be directed against groups or ethnicities. Sexualized violence is omnipresent every day and not only a problem of the others who are not white. Non-Germans, according to Welt, a German news network, to avoid future events like these from happening, Berlin has taken preventative measures by providing sexual education classes for refugees that include consent in its curriculum. Despite the growing opposition of the AfD and having to stand alone in the EU, Angela Merkel hopes her example of real leadership convinces her fellow European counterparts to follow her lead. She stated, Germany will continue to welcome refugees, or it would not be my country. It's important to understand that just because a human being is a refugee doesn't mean that they're automatically violent rapists. Just because I am Mexican, it doesn't mean that I am illegal or a drug dealer. The actions of few should not be grounds to discriminate against an entire ethnicity, religion, or culture. There are also fears that refugees and migrants will bankrupt welfare system. However, this simply doesn't happen since refugees obtain jobs and pay taxes. And a good example of this can be found in Germany, where they accepted about 1.3 million refugees. And despite the large influx of refugees who are entitled to public welfare payments, the number of welfare recipients actually dropped in years. This is probably because when refugees are integrated into Germany, they're encouraged to not depend on welfare, and with the help of job training programs and job fairs, they are able to find work. There's a common misconception that refugees and immigrants in general steal jobs from natives. However, this simply is not true. The Washington Post found that an influx of lower wage immigrants to the community raised wages for everyone else and more jobs. In essence, there is a small cost in a short term in comparison for a long-term economic growth. Refugees have also been found to revitalize struggling cities. Educating and skilling refugees is a win-win situation for both the refugee and society at large. Another common argument, particularly in the US, is that investing in reallocating refugees takes away from the other budgets that could help their own citizens, like helping veterans. However, there's no direct correlation between having less refugees and more veteran aid. In fact, veterans are most often used as a political prop to support or antagonize values that aren't in line with their values of veterans. Some veterans have started the organization Veterans for American Ideals to fight Islamophobia and lobby for refugees. This is not a one-way street. Syrian refugees in Newmark and Seattle have donated their time and resources to help homeless veterans. I had prepared a full list of countries, ready to call them out, including my own, for destabilizing the Middle East and South America, thereby being parties to blame for the humanitarian crisis both in the Middle East and Mexican-American border. However, I think it's important. I do think it's important for us to be aware of our history, and even though we right now in this room did not create those systems of oppressions, we still benefit from them. Regardless of which nation invaded Iraq, we all have a responsibility to our refugees and asylum seekers to protect their inalienable rights as human beings. I want to bring to the spotlight some refugees who have truly testified to the international community what they can do if they are given a chance at a safe life. Yek Purbiel is a member of the first refugee Olympic team at the 2016 Rio Games. He worked hard and earned a scholarship after fleeing his native country of Sudan. Now he uses his platform to inspire refugees to let them not be ashamed of being a refugee and prove to the world that refugees are not taking an easy way out, but are worth listening to. His activism is a true shining example of what refugees are capable of. Another refugee that many don't know is a refugee is Madeleine Albright. She fled with her family from Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939. She became a U.S. ambassador to the UN in 1933 and became the first female Secretary of State. She now chairs the National Democratic Institute of International Affairs. Clearly, if we give refugees a chance, they will take the chance and succeed. They will be our leaders, they will be our helpers, they will be our foundation for a better world. Another important aspect of aiding refugees is that if refugees are reliant on government handouts, the problem will never end, and it's very reminiscent of colonialism. We need to avoid the white savior complex. I've been told that a preferred term than help refugees is to aid refugees. Provide them the resources and protections necessary to ensure a sustainable and independent life. This requires financial and action support, systemic change within the humanitarian system. So here are some solutions that I listed out. A few that really stand out to me are the private sponsorship of refugees program in Canada. Basically, five or more people can join in together and raise money to bring a Syrian family to Canada by themselves using the government. Of course, this is unique to Canada, But this is just one of the many examples where the people don't need the government to help refugees. Like, they took it into their own hands to bring them, and they are still consistently raising money and advocacy. Another important one for me personally was to meet a refugee. It was truly humbling and an amazing experience because I learned so much from them, and they have, honestly, it sounds cliche, but it really did change my perspective. It brought me a whole new lens to look at the world from. Another important solution is to vote and realize that your vote can save lives. Because when you vote for someone who is xenophobic and has strong anti-discriminatory policies, those are dangerous. Those actually kill people. Like I said before, our silence is violence. We need to encourage others to vote for the best candidate that, well, if we are in a country that can vote, so for the best candidate that promotes self-reliance and promotes integrating refugees into society. I also would like to highlight properly integrating refugees into schools, the economy, and social lives in their new countries. Of course, it's really hard for refugees to come into a new country without having their family to support them. They literally had to uproot everything they have and come to a new country. So it's important that we provide them the proper access to the labor market, to a social life, and really be welcoming rather than be shouting racist slurs, or we should be overcoming our stigmas and prejudices that our governments have instilled in us. Another active measure that you can take now is to read an unbiased history textbook, because history keeps repeating itself. We in the US turned away the Vietnamese, the Irish, the Cubans, and the Haitians. And we even sent Jews and innocent German children back to Europe during World War II. Obviously, one of our biggest regrets and shames in our country's history. Why did we turn away the Jewish asylum seekers? Over the slim possibility that they might be Nazi spies. Sounds familiar? This same rhetoric is used to deny Muslim refugees asylum because they quote unquote might be terrorists. However, what's the point of history if we don't learn from it? All must have access to a proper education system that brings awareness and accepts responsibility for crimes committed against humanity. When negotiating for reparations in 1952, which is post-World War II, Israeli leaders asked the German government a striking question. Have you murdered and also inherited? The German Chancellor, Adenauer, knew the answer, and we should too. In 1949, Germany amended its constitution to outlaw the use of symbols and incite hatred against any segment of its population. The Constitution also guarantees asylum to political refugees and all people fleeing war. Refugees are literally a part of the Constitution, and as such, Germany has been graciously accepting many refugees. This corroborates with the German term Willkommenskultur, which means a cultural welcome, which I wish more countries would adopt. However, by 2016, a large percentage of Germany wanted a cap on refugees, according to the polls, which is alarming for the global refugee crisis. Other countries, such as the Netherlands, Hungary, and Denmark, are actively hostile towards refugees, telling them not to come, saying that harsh regulations and a difficult life will await them if they do try to come. They purchase thousands of feet of barbed wire placed around their country. They send in false propaganda about why not to come to Denmark in Arabic and send them to countries where refugees are in. They also, I think Denmark has been known to take away the few possessions, jewelry, and money that refugees had to distribute the cost of them coming to Denmark, which is just unacceptable. Although I mentioned the rise in nationalism, thousands of Germans do support refugees and even meet them at borders to kindly greet them, like I showed before. The reason why I wanted to heavily incorporate Germany into my presentation is that there are many lessons that are found in Germany's response to the Holocaust that can be applied to humanitarian responses worldwide. In 2013, 68 years after the end of the Holocaust, Germany committed to paying $1 billion for the care of elderly Holocaust survivors. These policies are congruent with an open admission of guilt, and as a result, the country is able to heal and promote a healthy society, rather than try to erase its tinted history. This is how true justice is served. Countries have benefited and still benefit financially at the expense of human lives. As a result, as people in positions of privilege, we have a responsibility to educate ourselves, to educate others, to encourage immigration, to encourage the acceptance of refugees, and so much more. Because it is at their expense that we are in these positions of privilege in the first place. I think it's important for people to understand that reparations are not limited to a specific time in history, but rather a continuous, evolving, and adapting process. Although it's important to consider our responsibility to help refugees, what's most important is to recognize is that they are human beings in need. I think that often gets overlooked as part of society, and government criminalize them rather than humanize them through their bravery and sacrifice. I've thought to myself before presenting, what gives me the right to speak about refugees when I myself am not one? I may not have fled my own country, but my mom immigrated from Mexico to the US, so that her posterity could have a better life than the one she led on a tiny butchery in Mexico. Because of her, I get to have access to all these educational opportunities in America, to educate myself on global issues and to participate in amazing organizations such as Model UN Impact. I acknowledge my privilege in being born in the US, but people like my mother, and with my skin color, still face oppression regardless of our citizenship. My country is allegedly founded by immigrants prioritizes a skin color that isn't mine, and 3 centuries after its founding, it still is the home of xenophobia and the land of racism. My people, the Mexicans, are still being criminalized like animals, and my country is caging them up and losing innocent children. So to answer my own question, the topic of refugees is personal, and refugees deserve to have their rights as human beings protected and ensured. To conclude, I want every person in this Zoom room right now who would be happy to be treated as this society in general treats refugees to please unmute and state why. That says very plainly that you know what's happening. You know you don't want it for yourself, so we should not be willing to accept it or allow it for others. And that's from Jane Elliott. Many of us in this Zoom room may not have $1 billion to donate to the UNHCR or wish our governments could do more to help refugees, but we don't need to be billionaires or live in Canada or Germany to help refugees. We can help refugees in many different ways, and even by presenting at a workshop at a global summit. In closing, I'd like to quote Dr. Seuss. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Thank you for taking your time to listen to me. And if there are any questions, please ask away. Thank you.
Oh, Renata, I think you are muted.
So the questions are being dropped in the chat, and Cynthia, would you like us to moderate them, or are you okay to take them on by yourself?
I can take them on by myself, that's fine.
All right. Okay.
So Alina R from the USA asked, who are the refugees that you met in Germany from? The refugees that I met in Germany, I'm pretty sure were from Iran, and they were 15, 13, 7, and 5 years old. I met 4 of them, and they were 3 were sisters, and the other was a cousin, and so it was really nice to hear that they were able to be together. And when I met them, like, we went to go watch a movie theater because we went to go watch a movie because my host mom teaches them German and helps them transition to life in Germany. So that's how I became passionate about refugees. How do we effectively advocate for our how do we effectively advocate for our governments and people in our country to change their views on refugees? That's a great question. So part of the solutions I listed was letter writing campaigns. Something I like to do on social media is to post on Instagram a post from the UNHCR or anything related to refugees, and there's something that you can do where you can add an icon where you can donate money to. And so that's another easy way to help. Another way would be to take part in MUN at home. We recently did the UNHCR Economic Inclusion of Refugees. So really be educated, educate others, and my other suggestion for advocacy would be to meet a refugee and to embolden them and strengthen them.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm really trying to understand that what basically a refugee is. Like, why can't a person, if he suffers any, like anything in his own country, why can't he go legally to move to another country? Like, if I suffer something in my own country, I could passport. I could go through. I could go to another country through passport and through legal terms.
Okay.
What
Well,
would you like to say about that?
yeah, well, when people are being killed by terrorists and persecuted they don't have the means to be able to buy a plane ticket. They don't have the money. Clearly, people living in these conditions do not have the money. They don't have the resources. They don't have the legal assistance to be able to buy a plane ticket like we can so easily. That's just not something that's even a possibility for them. And even then, taking those airlines, which are controlled by the government, is also dangerous. And so this is why it's important for refugees to go through the UNHCR, because that way they are ensured safety. And whereas if they were to do another way, they were to try to, like you said,
Like
choose
through a
to
border?
immigrate. It's not that simple, especially with the Dublin Convention, because the country who processes refugees is the one that they are first in. And if they keep on crossing and they don't know where they are, or if they just keep on crossing and they end up in another country, they'll be sent back to the first country they landed on. So yeah.
Oh, okay.
Romir asked, are refugees an asset or liability to nations in which they live? I think that they are an asset 100% because they provide a different culture. More diversity has been proven to be more beneficial to a society. In Europe especially, they're in desperate need of more people because they are currently not sustainable. And honestly, there's a risk with everything. There's a risk every time you drive a car. There's a risk every time you walk out the door. There's a risk right now getting coronavirus, but it clearly has not stopped us from going to the grocery store, hasn't stopped us from driving a car. And just like that, we can accept and acknowledge the risks, but the risks are literally 1 out of 3 billion. And so almost negligible. And clearly the UNHCR has been taking safety procedures with the rigorous screening and the many defense departments and intelligence agencies which screen refugees and take them through a rigorous process. It's honestly unlikely. Like, they're not really a risk, honestly. I'm more concerned about the terrorists that we have in the United States with access to guns than I am to refugees, if I'm going to be honest.
Cynthia, for that wonderful answer. We apologize for the inconvenience earlier. I believe Anwarul has raised his hand for a question.
Yes, sounds good.
Anwarul from Bangladesh, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. I think Anwarul might be facing technical difficulties. We'll move on to the next person. Mariam, our own admin, has a question to you. Mariam, go ahead.
Question is, I really enjoyed your presentation and I really agree with a lot of what you said, but there was this one particular slide that you shared, which was, I think there was these two refugees and you were sharing like their achievements. Do you think that kind of feeds into the model minority myth that we should be, we should be more accepting of minorities and refugees just because they have something to provide and not because they're humans that deserve shelter and food and a chance at life?
No, and that's specifically why I added in my conclusion that although there are benefits, like the most important thing is to adhere to our humanity, and that's been something that's been promoted by the UN and its NGOs that really that we should not be backing down by our principles as human beings, because those are the principles that were already set in place. We saw that, and honestly, in the context of the 1951 Refugee Convention, it was lots of people were completely willing to help. All these countries were willing to help because the refugees were white Christians. But now, all of a sudden, they're Muslims, and all the sources of money and help and advocacy have dried up. And that's not okay. That's clear racism and xenophobia. And whether it's a white refugee or a Muslim refugee, they both deserve to be treated as human beings. And that's something I value at the very top, and it's a very top priority. I definitely did not mean to try to push a model minority image, especially since like I myself am a minority and I can definitely feel that pressure. I was just using those examples of prominent refugees to show that when we give people the opportunity, they take it. And these people are human beings, and they have achieved and have the potential to achieve even more. But they just need they just need the resources that we as human beings have, but that they have been neglected for too long.
Thank you, I really appreciate that.
Thank you for the answer. I believe the director of Help for Refugees, Jordan Hattar, has a question that was posted in the chat. But if Mr. Hattar would like to state it out loud, please go ahead.
Thank you. Cynthia, I really enjoyed your talk. And I'm actually from close to Monterey, and I have family in Pacific Grove. And I'm just wondering, what have been some of your tactics to try to counter the Islamophobia that you may face in Monterey? And what have you found successful? What kind of initiatives at your school?
Well, at my school right now, I'm working with my friend Kate Popke, and she's started this pop-up shop called Made for Change, and I'm really pushing forward that we use part of the proceeds from that because we're basically dividing it into 4 areas, like Black Lives Matter, immigration, mental health, and I forgot the other one, but that's part of the advocacy, and I'm in charge of the research. And so I really like writing essays, gathering data, and that's really how my mind is geared. And so as part of the, basically in charge of research, part of my job is to create these slides on Instagram and stuff with information, and these informational posts are posted everywhere. And so I've already started out with the outline for the information. I'm just waiting for the other friend Katie to create those slides, because she's in charge of digital design. But just promoting information, I really think right now social media is an excellent tool. Many people probably aren't being taught about refugees at school, and so I think it's really important that we as youth tackle the hard questions, we have the hard conversations. And I've also joined a town hall for mental health advocacy, which is going to happen later on with my friend Anna, and I've advocated for the defunding of the police and for investing in immigration resources and other human resources in my community, because the police budget gets like half of the total budget, and that's unacceptable. And so I thought that this presentation would be really good foundation for me for my next steps in helping refugees, and I definitely plan to work with them in the future. So thank you for asking.
Thank you, Cynthia, for those wonderful answers. Unfortunately, our workshop has come to its end, so I'd like to thank all participants and our wonderful Cynthia and our guest hosts on behalf of Model United Nations Impact. And I'd also like to thank my fellow admin, Mariam, and our executives. So in conclusion, if you don't mind, and if Mr. Andrew would like to do so, please open your cameras so that Mr. Andrew can take a shot.
Fabulous. We end the screen share. That would be great.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
It's okay. Everyone turn your cameras on. Beautiful.
And I want to tell you how thrilled I am to have Jordan here sitting in on this session. This is absolutely the kind of connection and collaboration that we seek. So Jordan, thank you for being here. And Cynthia, thank you again for an amazing presentation.
Yeah, Cynthia, if you would stick around at the very end, that would be great before we close the room.
Sounds
All
good.
right, beautiful. Thank you all very much. I can see all your faces, beautiful. There's one more camera coming on there. Maybe give me a wave. Yay, thank you all. Fantastic, terrific. All right, thank you interpreters. Thank you to our leadership team, admin. And thank you, Cynthia, for sharing your wealth of knowledge and your passion. All right.
Thank you all.